Have you ever heard a cave breathe before? Most people think that caves underwater are quiet, but they're not. They'll actually groan and they'll hiss. And then sometimes they can even swallow a man up so completely that you would think that the earth was trying to just keep a secret to itself. On August 18, 2010, northern Florida, a diver named Ben McDaniel entered into Vortex Springs and he vanished. People saw him go in, but nobody ever saw him come out. There was no body, there was no bones, no blood in the water. It was just a cave and 15 years of arguments that have transpired trying to figure out what happened. Ben McDaniel wasn't just some reckless teenager out looking for attention. He was 30 years old. By all accounts, he was smart, athletic. He was very experienced with the water. He was the kind of man that people would describe as, brave and fearless. And sometimes, though, that can be a double-edged sword because fearless men and brave men are sometimes the easiest ones to bury. Ben came from a wealthy family outside of Tennessee, and he was very adventurous. He was into rock climbing, diving, just exploring in general. He was the kind of guy that just needed motion in his life, I guess, to be happy or to feel alive. But by 2010, though, things started kind of collapsing around him. His marriage had ended, his construction business failed, there were some serious financial problems hanging over him, and then worst of all, his younger brother Paul died a couple of years earlier. And it wasn't like he just died. I mean, it was very unexpected, but it's believed that Ben actually found his brother, and then he had to carry that image and that pain around in his brain for years. And that's one of the things about grief in some people. Grief doesn't always just lash out right at that time frame. Sometimes it'll actually sit, find a nice little quiet spot in the corner of your brain, and just sit and wait for another opportunity to rise up again. Ben's parents thought Florida might actually help Ben recover. They owned a beach house near Santa Rosa Beach on the Gulf Coast, and they offered to let him stay there for a while to have no pressure, no business problems, just some sunlight, some salt air, and some diving, lots of diving. And for a while, it seemed to be working. Ben's girlfriend was saying that he seemed optimistic again. He was talking about the future and about becoming a dive instructor and ultimately just building some sort of life around the water. And there was this one place, though, that just kept him fixated and obsessed, where he had to just keep going back to it. Vortex Spring. It was just an obsession of his, really. And the thing about obsessions is that they rarely turn out in the long run to be good things. Now, if you drove past Vortex Spring in the daytime, you probably wouldn't think much of it. There's going to have families out there swimming. There's tourists laughing. There's this crystal clear blue water that kind of bubbles up from under the ground. And it looks, on the surface, very harmless. And that's just how nature can get you sometimes, because the treacherous places don't always look dangerous from the surface. And Vortex Springs, it sits in Florida, kind of near the woods in the limestone country. And the water stays roughly 68 degrees year-round. And it's cold enough to remind you that this water, it comes from somewhere deep and dark. Now, recreational divers love it there because the real attraction, it's not just the spring itself and the area where people are swimming, it's the actual cave system that's below and down deep. And that cave had a reputation. It wasn't altogether a good one. More than a dozen divers had already died there in the years preceding Ben even showing up. So the owners naturally installed some sort of a safety mechanism. They put a gate around the cave. Now, I'm not talking about a gate or a warning sign on the surface. They didn't put it up on the land where the common sense lives. They stuck it down right at the entry level of this treacherous cave. And the sign itself actually had a picture of the Grim Reaper on it, which is kind of a universal way of telling you to turn your ass around. And that's where they left it, and only certified cave divers were supposed to go beyond that point. And they would have a key where they could access this gate and go through. Now, getting your cave diving certification, that's not just some little weekend hobby. It takes many months, hundreds of dives, and it's training that's specifically designed to keep people from just, dying in a treacherous little cave, a tight enclosed space. Because caves, they don't forgive mistakes, not even small ones. The passages in this system alone will get very narrow the deeper you worked your way into it. In some spots, it's like 10 inches in width. And so now the only way for a diver to get through some of these very narrow spots is to do something just absolutely insane. They have to take off their tank, and they'll have to push it ahead of them while they twist and turn to get through this narrow passage. And this is going through just hundreds of feet of limestone sometimes. And at some point, this form of exploration starts to look more like voluntary entombment. And this is not for the inexperienced. And Ben McDaniel was not cave certified. But that didn't stop him, though. According to people at the spring, Ben had been obsessed with that cave anyhow. And employees had suspected that he'd been sneaking down beyond that gate for weeks, maybe even longer. And he was finding ways to kind of jimmy the gate open and get in without a key. And then he was in the process studying the cave, studying it out, mapping it, and writing a journal about it. And he was trying to push himself further and further each time. And there's a kind of personality that develops around dangerous hobbies like this. It's if a man survives enough close calls, eventually the problem is that man starts to think that the rules, these little safety requirements, those don't apply to him. They apply to somebody else, not him. On August 18th, 2010, the Florida heat was just brutal that day, and Ben spent most of the morning time frame just kind of preparing around the spring. He was getting his equipment ready, he was testing his gear, and he was writing notes, apparently, according to people, in his diver's log. He seemed like a man planning something. And as evening approached, while other people all around are packing up to go home, well, that's when Ben was getting ready to go down into that cave. And around 7:30 that evening, two dive shop employees, Chuck Cronin and Eduardo Taran, they were coming up from the cave and they were seeing Ben descending. Now, Taran had long suspected that Ben was getting through that gate system. So instead of stopping him, he decided he'd just go swim down to the gate, open it up for him, and that's what he did. And then he watched Ben kind of disappear off into the darkness. Now, on some nights, though, Taran would actually stay nearby the cave, and he'd wait to see bubbles coming back up from the system. And that was a way of telling other divers that somebody was decompressing and getting ready to come back up to the surface. But on that day, though, nobody stuck around. Nobody watched for him, and nobody knows what happened to Ben after he crossed into that area of darkness past the gate. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen what panic looks like in a diver? And I'm not talking about panic that you might have seen in a movie before. I'm talking about real panic, something you don't just see in a training video where everybody just has a good laugh afterwards. It's one of the ugliest things you'll actually ever see. You can only get that type of experience when you're a man that realizes that they may not have enough air to reach daylight. Now, the thing about this kind of panic, it doesn't happen all at once. At first, it's something kind of simple. It's not very dramatic. It comes typically with, some confusion. You miss a turn, you get tangled up, your hose snags on something, kick up too much silt, and then your flashlight catches some suspended silt in the air, and the tunnel doesn't look familiar anymore. And then you start to kind of get a little bit more antsy. You're swishing around trying to find your bearings. Then the visibility starts to disappear more because even more silt starts to come up. And now you've got a problem because you really can't tell your way around the cave anymore. You can't even almost tell up from down. And then your brain starts doing some weird arithmetic on you. It starts thinking about the distance, the air, the time, the depth, and how far you have to go back to get to the entrance. And then you start to notice that your breathing has changed. And when your breathing changes, you start using up more air. And then you get scared. And then when fear enters into the equation, well, that's when the oxygen really starts to dissipate fast. And your breathing gets even shorter. Chest starts to tighten a little bit, breathing even gets harder, and that regulator just starts making this sound that would drive you crazy, just the whole little every inhale you have is louder and louder, and that's all you hear. And you become essentially like some animal that's drowning and he's trying to suck air through a straw just to stay alive. And all around you, that's when that cave just starts shrinking in, just getting a little tighter and tighter on you. And then that darkness just gets thicker. And it's not nighttime darkness. It's not close your eyes darkness. It's darkness like you can't see your hand 6 inches in front of your face. And as you keep swishing around, the water kind of turns into a blizzard of suspended silt mud, and you can't see anything around that tunnel. You don't know where your exit is. You don't know if you're swimming towards your freedom or in further into your grave. And then when you start to feel that fear even deeper inside of your body, that's when that old cave really starts to go to work on you. The ceiling starts to kind of press down on you a little bit. Maybe a rock catches you on the shoulders. You're trying to get through these other little crevices. You try to back up, but then your gear, it snags. And then your breathing gets faster. You can't help it. You can't stop it. Even though you try to calm yourself down, you can't make it stop. And then carbon dioxide, slowly but surely, this whole time has been building up in your blood. And carbon dioxide to a diver, that's just nothing but nightmare fuel, because it creates within you this hunger that's so violently craving air that it starts to override all the reason you have left in your brain. And every instinct in you starts to scream out the same thing. I got to get out of here. We got to get out of this tunnel. We got to get out of this cave and up and get fresh air. And that's when you finally start to respect you're in a place you were never meant to be, ever. I don't care if you've got a tank on you, a mask, some flippers. Human beings were never meant to be in this spot. Experienced cave divers have theorized that what happened to Ben, possibly, if he died in that system, it's that he did what a lot of trapped divers do kind of near the end. He may have, in his panic, started to force himself into other restrictions in these little crevices along the way, thinking that was the way out, trying to escape. And then when that happens, though, ultimately you get trapped and your chest gets crushed between limestone walls. Your tank is just wedged in behind you and you can't move around. You can't turn, you can't lift up. And then that cold rock just kind of starts pushing in on your ribs, making it harder and harder for you to breathe. And then your lungs, as you slowly but surely start to run out of air, they start burning for oxygen. And at this point, the diver will get even more desperate and they'll start clawing around and even rip their fingernails off as they're trying to claw through this, pull themselves through this crevice, and they're twisting and kicking. They're just trying to force themselves to a space that the body was never designed to enter. And then they get frustrated. The regulator hose just seems like it can't stop getting snagged on something. And sometimes they'll even bang their head, scratch up their goggles on this limestone. All this is happening while that cave is just swallowing up all the sound and the light. And eventually, a diver will reach the point when terror kind of wins over. Because there's going to come a point when the oxygen is leaving your body and you're craving it so much that the brain just breaks down even more. Thoughts collapse. All that training you've ever had, it just disappears and your instinct takes over. And sometimes a drowning man will actually just rip the regulator hose right out of their mouth, even though they know better. And even though they know every survival instinct within their body is telling them you got to stop. But that's just because the need for air becomes so overwhelming that the body, despite what the mind's telling it, the body does not care that the water that's all around them is not air. And then that first involuntary gasp, that ice cold water rushes down your throat and fills up your lungs. And then the chest will just start to kind of try to convulse and try to force a cough underwater, which is essentially almost impossible in this state. And for a few terrible seconds, the diver's still alive. And they're still conscious. They're sitting there suspended in this water. And they realize what's happening to them. And then the panic will eventually start to slow down. And it's not because the fear is gone, because that's still very real, but it's because your brain is shutting down. Your vision will start to narrow, your movements weaken, and then eventually the fight will just drain out of your muscles, and your eyes they'll just stop looking around for the exit, just kind of stare blankly ahead, looking off into the darkness, as the last little bit of consciousness that's left in your body just starts to realize, it finally hits them that the life that they once had is now, it's gone. And that's how a diver dies. It's just with a lifeless body fading quietly into the darkness. And some divers believe that Ben McDaniel may have removed his tanks and tried to squeeze himself through one final restriction that was just too deep inside that cave. And somewhere deep in these passages that no diver has successfully searched to date, he may actually still be there today, just buried inside the earth itself. Now, by the next morning, Ben's truck, of course, was still sitting in the parking lot. His wallet was there. He had close to $700 cash, his phone, his gear, or what remained of his gear, his other belongings, everything that is except Ben. When it was clear that Ben hadn't been coming back to his truck, it was obvious to everybody that something happened to Ben in the cave. And this wasn't going to be a search and rescue type deal. This was a recovery mission. It was a dangerous recovery mission, but it was a recovery mission nonetheless. Search teams descended into the water in Vortex Spring almost immediately. You had some divers start to come, and then more divers came, and more divers came, and eventually about 16 experienced divers would spend up to 36 days searching for Ben McDaniel. They made hundreds of dives, thousands of feet of underwater cave were explored. You had flashlights pushing through every crack, crevice, every dead end was explored, and every place that could possibly hide a body in this cave was looked into. But every search turned up the same result: nothing. There's no body, no bones, no equipment. There was ultimately no sign of decomposition, which would ultimately flood the cave with a bunch of carnivorous fish looking for a decomposing body. But in this instance, there was none of that. There was no trace. It was as if Ben McDaniel had never even entered that cave at all. Now, if you're going to be searching for a missing diver and everybody else has come up empty-handed with a result, eventually you're going to end up calling a guy named Ed Sorensen. Because Ed Sorensen, he's not just some hobbyist, he's not a YouTube expert. He was a legendary recovery cave diver. When Ben disappeared, Sorensen was out of the country on an expedition, but he returned just within a few days later. And then he jumped into Vortex Spring himself. He went down for at least 2 dives, and he searched deeper and farther in that cave system than anybody else. He went into places that most experienced divers would not enter for any form of payment or compensation. And after those dives, he said something that divides this case today. He told authorities and investigators, you need to start looking for other possibilities. Because in Sorensen's view, nothing about Ben's story was adding up. According to Sorensen, these writings and maps that Ben had been making, they did not reflect the reality of what was in that cave. The cave layout wasn't right, the passages weren't right, the details just weren't fitting into place, which led Sorensen to a very troubling conclusion. It's that maybe Ben had never reached any of those places at all. And if he never reached them, then exactly where did he go? Sorensen later explained that Ben was approximately 6'1", decent-sized guy, weighed about 210 pounds. While Sorensen, on the other hand, was 6 foot, but he was about 20 pounds lighter, weighing around 190. And a bigger difference is that Ben wasn't cave certified, while Sorensen was exceptionally certified, made hundreds and thousands of dives, And he had years of cave recovery experience, which Ben had very little cave exploration experience. And even with all of Sorensen's experience, he said, I know what I'm doing, and I barely made it through these restrictions. And then Sorensen went on to say something even more haunting. He got into one of the last restrictions that was exceptionally pristine. It was untouched. The clay wasn't disturbed. There were no scrapes on the limestone. There was no damage to the ceiling, no marks on the floor, nothing. And caves, they don't stay pristine after a diver has to force and push his way through with these tanks, particularly not a diver that weighs 210 pounds, particularly not a diver that was dragging his tanks, and particularly not a diver that has very little cave experience. Sorensen's conclusion was absolutely blunt. He's not in that cave. It's not a probably, it's not a maybe, it's not a likely, it's that he was not in the cave at all. And when the most experienced cave diver, cave recovery diver, is telling you this, that's when people start paying attention and asking some uncomfortable questions. That's when the cadaver dogs showed up. The dogs searched the property for hours. According to reports, they actually alerted on 2 locations, one near the shoreline and another one that was actually in the water itself. Now, just because a dog alerts like this, it doesn't mean that there's proof that a murder happened. It honestly is not proof of anything entirely by itself, but it does have a way of making investigators start to pay attention, especially when no body can be found, and especially when the world's most experienced cave recovery diver is saying that the missing man that we're all looking for, he's not in that cave. So what happened to Ben? Well, there's some theories, and the first one tends to make the most sense and might actually be the cleanest. It's just that Ben died in the cave. He was lost, he was trapped, he got buried beyond reach, and nobody's been able to find him. Problem with that is not everybody believes it. Not after you have Sorensen saying he wasn't in the cave, not after the dogs, and not after just this complete lack of evidence inside the cave itself that Ben was even there. So if Ben wasn't in the cave, what does that mean if Ben actually made it out? Because if he surfaced, even just briefly, that changes the story entirely. And some theorize that Ben may have died near the surface, maybe on his way up, or maybe something happened to him on the surface itself. We don't know. And that someone may have actually panicked, fearing a liability in some way, a lawsuit, maybe even prison. And then investigators started to think about the people that had last seen Ben that day. And then that's when this name got brought up about a guy named Lowell Kelly. Now, Lowell Kelly actually owned Vortex Spring, and he was one of the last people to have seen Ben alive that day. And according to later reporting, Kelly had his own theories, which he liked to share with people about what happened to Ben. He claimed that on the night that Ben disappeared, a strange man entered into the dive shop, and he looked wild-eyed and maybe even intoxicated, and he was asking Kelly if it was too late, too dark to go diving. Now, Kelly clearly thought this was odd, and he decided he needed to mention it to the investigators. However, people started to think that Kelly himself was actually the odd one. He was loud, he was opinionated, he frequently would offer theories about Ben's disappearance, and he had this wild, unsupported idea that Ben actually staged his own disappearance and fled off to the Cayman Islands. But the more people kept digging into this situation and looking into even Kelly, other uncomfortable facts started to surface. In the years before Ben had vanished, Kelly had actually been accused of attacking a man with a baseball bat near Vortex Spring during a dispute involving money. And Kelly was actually later convicted of an aggravated battery, and he was placed on probation. And of course, while this doesn't prove he did something to Ben, it still didn't stop people from wondering. So investigators then started to look at Eduardo Taran and then the other employee. They actually gave them polygraphs. And now Taran again was the one that used his key, swam back down with Ben, to open the gate and let Ben go into the cave, even though he wasn't dive certified. Now, Tarn passed his polygraph test, and so did the other employee. And officially, no one's ever been charged with a crime or any involvement in Ben's disappearance. The authorities have never uncovered any concrete facts of foul play. And then there was this theory, of course, that Ben had staged his own disappearance. He had, of course, the financial problems, the emotional trauma, a failed marriage, and his brother had passed away. And some wondered if he had used this cave as the perfect way to vanish, especially since his maps in his cave logbook were not adding up. It's almost as if he was trying to make people think that he went just so far into the cave, and of course nobody can verify if his maps are correct because they couldn't get that far in. But the biggest problem, it seems like, with that theory is that his family just is not convinced that, given the pain they had all suffered from Paul dying just 2 years earlier, there's no way that Ben would just skip off right off into the sunset and leave everybody behind and go spend his day drinking pina coladas on the Cayman Islands. Now, as the time passed, something else strange happened with the case, and it wasn't supernatural. It was just human desperation, and in a lot of ways that can be worse. You see, Ben McDaniel wasn't the last person that cave would claim. As the months turned into years, Ben's parents became convinced that Ben was still in that cave. Despite what Sorensen said, he's in that cave, he's just further in there. And they just need somebody braver to go in and locate him. So they offered a reward. And at first it was a $10,000 reward. That wasn't enough. They increased it to 20, and eventually it made its way all the way up to $30,000. Again, to anybody brave enough to go in this cave and bring our boy back out. And that's where the diving community started to have a backlash. They started to fear that it wasn't about the recovery of Ben. They were worried about what this reward would entice other divers to do. This cave didn't care about bravery. In fact, the cave had already claimed the lives of 12 brave men before Ben ever showed up. And now, of course, we've got this money waiting at the bottom to help solve this mystery. And then in 2012, all this fear became a reality as to what could happen. Another diver entered Vortex Spring. His name was Larry Higginbotham. And just like Ben, he went in and never came back out alive. He was a different man, it was a different dive, but it was still the same cave. His body was recovered the next day, and there was no proof that he had been searching for Ben, but not everybody's convinced. Some of the divers believed that he was looking for something deep in that cave, something perhaps that nobody else had ever found. And you have to think about that backlash. You've got one man disappears a couple of years beforehand, a reward's in place for the recovery of this person, and then another one disappears. So eventually, that criticism became too loud to ignore for Ben's parents, so they ultimately pulled the reward. They didn't want anybody else getting hurt looking for Ben, and also by that time, they started asking themselves really difficult questions. These are questions that they never wanted to have to ask. But maybe Ben wasn't in that cave at all. Maybe something else had happened to him. Maybe the cave itself had just become this big distraction from a darker truth. And that's the thing about unsolved mysteries, is that the longer they live, the more people they can consume. And through it all, Vortex Springs, it never changed. It stayed exactly the same. It stayed cold, silent, keeping its secrets. And some places develop a reputation. And it's not because they're haunted, it's because humans keep underestimating them. Now maybe Ben McDaniel, he's still down there tonight. He's wedged inside some limestone restriction that no divers ever reached before. His remains are still behind stone and darkness, perhaps. Or maybe he surfaced and he encountered something waiting for him above the water. And maybe somebody knows exactly what happened to him and has spent 15 years just staying quiet. Or maybe the cave just simply did what caves have always done to proud men. It convinced Ben that he was actually better than the rules. And that's the terrifying part about this story is just, it's not the disappearance alone, it's the fact that the silence is deafening afterwards. It's not ending. There's no certainty. There's no grave for the family to visit. It's just this cold water coming up out of that spring endlessly. 28 million gallons every single day. As if that spring is just washing away any sort of evidence that Ben was ever there. There's something altogether eerie about deep water. It doesn't care how smart you are. It doesn't care if your life was just finally getting better, and it doesn't care if your family's going to miss you. And somewhere, perhaps tonight, in Vortex Spring, there's another diver down there exploring, thinking the rules don't apply to him. And he may too be holding on to his last breath.